Jamie Yazzie's vehicle was still parked outside her home on the evening of June 30th, 2019. The keys sat untouched inside. Her cell phone lay on the passenger seat, screen dark, battery drained. She had clocked out from work hours earlier at a healthcare center in Pinon, Arizona, but never made it back to her children. A neighbor later recalled seeing her car there well into the night, but no one saw Jamie. By morning, her absence could no longer be explained away. She didn't call in for her next shift. She missed breakfast with her family, an event she never skipped. By midday, her relatives had filed a missing persons report with the Navajo Nation Police Department. Jamie Yazzie, 32 years old, mother of 3, was officially listed as missing. In communities like Pinon, within the vast Navajo Nation, cases of missing indigenous women are tragically common. According to federal databases, Native American women face murder rates 10 times higher than the national average. Yet even with these statistics, each case begins the same way, with silence. The investigation into Jamie Yazzie's disappearance started with that silence. Jamie Yazzie worked as a medical assistant. Her life revolved around providing care, both to her patients and to her family. There were no prior incidents of her vanishing, no erratic behavior, no known substance abuse. Her recent history showed stress from a volatile relationship, but nothing suggesting she would willingly abandon her life. Investigators from the Navajo Nation Police Department conducted the initial wellness check. They found no signs of forced entry at Jamie's home. There were no indications of a struggle. The house was in order, personal belongings intact. Her vehicle showed no evidence of damage, except for one thing: the position of her cell phone, abandoned, screen cracked in the lower corner. According to records later pulled from her provider, the phone ceased transmitting any data shortly after she clocked out from work that evening. At that point, with limited resources and no immediate evidence of foul play, the Navajo authorities could do little more than circulate Jamie's photo and last known whereabouts. No local witnesses came forward. No one had seen her leave her workplace under duress. No surveillance footage from nearby gas stations or businesses showed her after her shift. The case remained open, but stagnant. 12 days after Jamie's disappearance, family members escalated the case to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The involvement of the FBI was not standard protocol, but the intersection of tribal lands and federal jurisdiction, complicated by the overlapping laws of tribal, state, and federal agencies, meant that serious violent crimes on Navajo land could warrant federal oversight. FBI agents from the Gallup Resident Agency, part of the Phoenix Field Office, took over. Their first priority: reconstruct Jamie Yazzie's final movements. They obtained her phone records, no outgoing calls after her shift. The last incoming text was time-stamped at 6:45 p.m. from a friend confirming plans for the following week. No responses. They examined her bank accounts. No withdrawals. No credit card activity. No purchases that evening. They interviewed co-workers. Jamie had clocked out without any indication of distress. Her demeanor, according to colleagues, was normal, though one person recalled she had received a phone call late in the afternoon that appeared to upset her. She had taken the call outside, away from the nursing station, and returned visibly unsettled, but said nothing about it. The investigation expanded outward. FBI agents canvassed Jamie's acquaintances. They established a pattern of strained relations between Jamie and her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Tracy James, a resident of Pinon. James had a documented history of domestic disputes, including prior allegations of verbal threats against former partners but no felony convictions. When questioned, James stated he had been at home the night Jamie vanished. His timeline remained vague. He claimed to have spoken with her earlier that day, but denied any further contact. His phone records, when subpoenaed, showed a gap in activity between 7 p.m. and midnight. His cell tower data placed him at or near his residence. At this point in the investigation, there was no physical evidence directly connecting James or anyone else to Jamie's disappearance. In August 2019, after 6 weeks with no leads, the case shifted classification from a missing person to a potential homicide. The FBI initiated aerial searches, employing drones and fixed-wing aircraft to scan large stretches of land between Pinon and neighboring Hopi territory. Specialized search teams combed through remote areas where Jamie might have traveled or been taken. Still nothing. No body, no weapon, no witness. By the close of 2019, Jamie Yazzie was one of over 5,700 missing Indigenous women in the United States. Her name added to a list that rarely found closure. But this case wouldn't stay cold. By September 2019, 3 months after Jamie Yazzie's disappearance, the case sat at a crossroads. With no new evidence and no body recovered, the investigation risked sliding into the category of unsolved disappearances that plague Indigenous communities. The involvement of the FBI brought additional resources, but jurisdictional complexities between tribal, state, and federal authorities still slowed progress. The next phase of the investigation focused on two key objectives: mapping Jamie's social circle and scrutinizing the gaps in digital data from the evening she vanished. Agents needed more than assumptions. They required a timeline that could hold up in court. Jamie's personal and professional relationships became the primary focus. She worked at the Pinon Health Center, interacted daily with patients and co-workers, and maintained a small but tight network of friends. Interviews with colleagues revealed that Jamie had spoken of stressors in her personal life, primarily surrounding her on-again, off-again relationship with Tracy James. However, none reported direct threats or immediate concerns in the days leading up to her disappearance. The FBI's Victim Assistance Program engaged with Jamie's family, offering support while gathering contextual information. Relatives described her as reliable, caring, and dedicated to her children. Her sudden disappearance did not fit any prior behavioral patterns. Digital forensics next came under review. Analysts obtained Jamie's cell phone metadata from her service provider. The last outgoing activity occurred at 5:32 p.m. on June 30th, a text to a friend confirming a later call. No further texts, calls, or data usage followed. Her phone's connection to a cell tower near the Pinon Health Center ceased at approximately 6:15 p.m., suggesting she had not left the immediate area before her phone became inactive. Attention turned to the cell tower logs for other devices in the area during that time frame. Investigators identified several regular patterns: workers commuting home, local residents on evening errands, but one anomaly stood out. The phone belonging to Tracy James showed a sudden loss of signal at 7:04 p.m., despite typically remaining active through the evening hours in prior weeks. When questioned again, James claimed that poor signal coverage in the area was common. He reiterated that he had been at home that night, relaxing after work. His demeanor remained controlled. No physical evidence yet contradicted his story. Agents probed further into James's background. Though no felony convictions existed, his record revealed multiple domestic disturbance reports spanning several years. Former partners described escalating verbal threats, intimidation, and in one case, an unreported incident involving a firearm. Yet none of these encounters resulted in formal charges or arrests. While these reports didn't provide proof of involvement in Jamie's disappearance, they built a behavioral profile that warranted deeper investigation. A man with a documented pattern of controlling behavior and violent outbursts presented a clear risk factor in any missing person case, particularly when the missing individual had previously expressed fear regarding the relationship. Meanwhile, search operations expanded geographically. Over 40 square miles of terrain between Pinon and neighboring Hopi lands were examined. Search teams, supported by local volunteers, methodically covered remote desert areas, using cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. Yet no signs of Jamie surfaced. The investigation entered a holding pattern. Without a body, without a crime scene, law enforcement faced limitations on advancing the case. But pressure from Jamie's family, coupled with rising public attention surrounding the broader epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, MMIW, ensured the case stayed active. In December 2019, the FBI held a community meeting in Pinon to update residents. They disclosed limited details, acknowledging an open investigation, but withholding specifics. Still, one fact became clear. Jamie Yazzie's case was no longer being treated as a simple disappearance. Federal authorities were operating under the assumption that foul play was involved. By early 2020, federal investigators faced a familiar deadlock: a missing body, a limited witness pool, and jurisdictional roadblocks that complicated every step forward. The case of Jamie Yazzie, missing since June 30th, 2019, had entered its 7th month with no direct evidence of her whereabouts. But despite the absence of a crime scene or remains, the investigative team refined its approach, focusing on two emerging fronts: environmental forensic analysis and revisiting the behavioral patterns of key individuals. The first shift came from expanding the geographic scope. The area surrounding Pinon, Arizona consisted of sprawling high desert terrain, intersected by dirt roads and bordered by the Hopi Reservation. Search teams had initially concentrated on the immediate 10-mile radius around Jamie's home and workplace. However, aerial surveys, drone footage, and satellite imagery from the Bureau of Indian Affairs revealed unused trails and makeshift encampments scattered farther afield, locations not included in prior search grids. Investigators redeployed cadaver dogs, focusing on arroyos and washes, natural pathways where water could have displaced or concealed remains. Environmental forensic specialists advised that desert terrain, combined with seasonal weather, could quickly degrade or scatter physical evidence. Despite these challenges, search teams uncovered several disturbed sites, marked by shallow depressions or uneven ground cover, raising questions about potential human activity. At one such site, located roughly 23 miles northeast of Pinon, searchers retrieved a torn piece of fabric, partially buried beneath sand and loose debris. Forensic technicians conducted an immediate field test, confirming it as cotton blend material, consistent with work uniforms commonly issued at regional health centers, including Jamie's former place of employment. Lab analysis later revealed trace amounts of human blood embedded in the fibers. DNA profiling confirmed the blood belonged to Jamie Yazzie. This discovery shifted the investigation's tone. The presence of Jamie's blood-soaked clothing fragment, located far from her daily routes, reinforced the working theory of foul play and disposal of evidence across tribal boundaries. The site itself bore no other physical markers. No weapon, no additional remains, and no discernible prints. But it marked the first tangible forensic connection between Jamie's disappearance and a remote, off-grid location. Concurrently, the behavioral analysis team revisited Tracy James's historical movements. His work record showed he had briefly operated equipment on Hopi lands during a construction contract the prior year. His employment terminated months before Jamie's disappearance, yet his familiarity with back roads and off-reservation terrain provided a logistical possibility for transporting or concealing a body. Phone tower data, initially dismissed due to intermittent coverage, became a focal point once more. Analysts reviewed historic cell site logs, mapping James's previous routes across reservation lands. They identified two towers, one near Pinon and another bordering Hopi territory, where his device intermittently connected during non-working hours in the months preceding Jamie's disappearance. While no logs confirmed activity on the specific night in question, the overlap of personal history, geographic knowledge, and digital footprints began forming a clearer investigative picture. Investigators expanded inquiries into James's acquaintances, seeking patterns of shared behavior. Several individuals reported that James often camped in remote areas, hunting or engaging in unregistered construction jobs off-reservation. A former coworker mentioned James once bragged about knowing places where no one would find you if you didn't want to be found. While anecdotal, these statements aligned with the environmental evidence gathered near the torn fabric site. In March 2020, forensic analysts flagged one additional anomaly, a slight elevation in mineral composition found on the fabric fragment, consistent with soils unique to areas outside Pinon, particularly along the Hopi border region. This microscopic trace evidence, while circumstantial, further tethered the search grid to a specific corridor where James had previous access. Despite these developments, no body was recovered. Jamie Yazzie remained classified as missing, though forensic evidence now pointed toward homicide. By mid-2020, forensic leads in Jamie Yazzie's case had narrowed the search area and placed circumstantial pressure on one individual. But without a body, without a direct witness, the evidence remained incomplete. The FBI's behavioral analysis team shifted focus, aiming to build a profile that could withstand legal scrutiny, one not solely reliant on forensic fragments. This phase of the investigation centered on witness testimony, mapping out patterns of prior abuse and exposing inconsistencies in statements tied to Tracy James. The process began with re-interviews of Jamie Yazzie's close circle. While initial questioning yielded little more than concern and generalized statements about her relationship struggles, further conversations provided critical context. Several coworkers described occasional bruises on Jamie's arms and legs, visible when she rolled up her sleeves during work shifts. When asked, Jamie attributed the injuries to accidents, falls, clumsy moments at home, but a pattern emerged. The bruises were not isolated incidents. They occurred in cycles, appearing and fading at intervals that aligned with periods of relationship tension. One co-worker reported Jamie confiding off the record that she felt watched. She spoke about arguments escalating into physical confrontations, though she declined to pursue legal action. There was no formal documentation, but these statements established behavioral indicators of coercive control, a recognized precursor to intimate partner violence. Investigators followed this with interviews of prior partners of Tracy James. Two former girlfriends provided detailed accounts of threats, intimidation, and physical violence. One described an incident involving a firearm, where James allegedly held a gun to her head during an argument, threatening to end everything if she left. She had never filed a report. Fear of retaliation, compounded by limited faith in the justice system, silenced her. While these incidents occurred outside the immediate time frame of Jamie's disappearance, they provided behavioral consistency, patterns of escalation. The FBI's profiling team consolidated these findings, drawing parallels between James's history of abusive relationships and the likely outcome in Jamie's case. During this period, additional forensic work resumed on the fabric fragment found near Hopi lands. While the initial analysis confirmed Jamie Yazzie's blood, a secondary trace examination revealed minute organic particles, a mix of desert flora and soil compounds unique to the Washburn Wash, an area previously unexplored. This discovery expanded the search grid eastward. In August 2020, the FBI conducted targeted interviews within the Hopi community. Residents were asked about unusual activity during the summer of 2019, strangers in the area, vehicles parked where they shouldn't be, new encampments. One local reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck in early July 2019, parked near a dry creek bed, aligned with the Washburn Wash zone. While the sighting came weeks after Jamie's disappearance, it corroborated digital evidence showing James's cell activity overlapping these remote locations months prior. Confronted with these cumulative findings, Tracy James maintained his original narrative. His attorney stressed the lack of direct evidence, no witnesses placing him with Jamie at the time of her disappearance, no recovered weapon, no body. But the case against James evolved beyond physical presence. It became a matter of establishing opportunity, capability, and behavioral precedent. His familiarity with remote lands, prior violent conduct, and deceptive digital gaps marked him as the singular point of convergence in an investigation now operating on three fronts: behavioral profiling, forensic geography, and witness corroboration. In October 2020, investigators presented their findings to the U.S. Attorney's Office. While incomplete, the evidence warranted escalation. A grand jury was convened to determine whether the cumulative case justified charges of homicide. In January 2021, the federal grand jury convened in Phoenix, tasked with reviewing the composite evidence gathered over the previous 18 months in Jamie Yazzie's case. Despite the absence of a body, prosecutors presented a detailed timeline, emphasizing behavioral patterns, forensic findings, and geographic consistencies pointing toward foul play. The grand jury process was confidential, but key elements of the presentation were later disclosed through public filings. These included forensic reports tying Jamie's bloodied fabric fragment to a remote area near Washburn Wash, digital gaps in Tracy, James's cell phone activity on the night of her disappearance, and the profile of escalating intimate partner violence corroborated by witness testimony. The jury returned a sealed indictment against Tracy James on charges of murder, domestic assault, and evidence tampering. The indictment, although sealed, allowed federal agents to proceed with a search warrant for James's property. In February 2021, a coordinated operation took place. Federal agents, supported by the Navajo Nation Police and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, executed the warrant at James's residence and adjacent storage units. The search focused on recovering physical evidence, specifically firearms, ammunition, and personal items belonging to Jamie Yazzie. Among the recovered items were 2 handguns, neither registered in James's name, along with several rounds of ammunition. Ballistics testing could not immediately tie these weapons to Jamie's disappearance, given the lack of a crime scene or recovered remains. However, the serial numbers on one of the handguns had been filed off, a violation of federal firearms regulations and grounds for further legal action. Additionally, agents retrieved notebooks and personal effects from James's home, including photos and letters. While none directly referenced Jamie Yazzie, analysts identified patterns of language suggestive of threats and control in correspondence with prior partners. These findings supplemented the behavioral profile, but did not substitute for concrete forensic links. Simultaneously, forensic geologists reviewed soil samples collected during the Washburn Wash search. Their analysis confirmed that the mineral composition on the fabric fragment matched the unique sediment signature found along the wash's southern bank, specifically in areas where off-road vehicle tracks were identified. Investigators traced tire treads near the wash, comparing them to patterns found on James's pickup truck. The treads aligned in type and size but were insufficient as standalone evidence. In the absence of Jamie's remains, investigators pursued alternative forms of corroboration. They conducted polygraph tests on individuals close to James, including family members who had knowledge of his whereabouts during the summer of 2019. While polygraphs are inadmissible in court, they remain useful for guiding investigative direction. One relative displayed inconsistent responses when asked about James's movements following Jamie's disappearance, though they offered no direct admission. In March 2021, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, delivered a comprehensive report. It concluded that the behavioral patterns, access to remote locations, and efforts to conceal evidence demonstrated by James fit the profile of an escalated, intimate partner homicide. This reinforced the U.S. Attorney's position to move forward with charges despite the lack of human remains. On April 1, 2021, federal authorities unsealed the indictment and arrested Tracy James on charges of first-degree murder and domestic violence resulting in death. He was transported to a federal detention center where he awaited pretrial hearings. Public reaction was swift. Jamie Yazzie's name had been central to advocacy efforts in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women (MMIW) movement, and her case became emblematic of the systemic failures in protecting Indigenous women. Activists called for increased federal oversight, better data collection, and resources for tribal law enforcement. Despite the indictment, prosecutors faced a challenge: securing a conviction without a body. The no-body murder cases require a synthesis of circumstantial evidence that collectively proves beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim is deceased and the defendant is responsible. As preparations for trial began, prosecutors sought to bolster their case through expert testimony, forensic scientists, behavioral analysts, and digital forensic specialists to present a unified narrative before the jury. As the trial date approached in late 2022, federal prosecutors prepared to present a no-body homicide case, a complex legal strategy requiring the assembly of circumstantial evidence into a cohesive narrative that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Without Jamie Yazzie's remains, the prosecution leaned heavily on forensic experts, behavioral analysts, and digital forensic data to establish two key points: that Jamie was dead and that Tracy James was responsible. The prosecution began by addressing pretrial motions filed by the defense. James's legal team sought to exclude specific evidence, particularly testimony from former partners who had described patterns of abuse and intimidation. The defense argued that these incidents, occurring years prior, were prejudicial and lacked direct connection to Jamie's case. Prosecutors countered that the testimony was critical in establishing a pattern of coercive control and escalating violence, aligning with Jamie's disappearance. In October 2022, the court ruled in favor of the prosecution, allowing the testimony under Federal Rule of Evidence 404(b), permitting the inclusion of past behaviors that demonstrate motive, opportunity, or intent. This ruling reinforced the prosecution's ability to paint a broader picture of James's history and its relevance to Jamie's disappearance. At the center of the prosecution's strategy was forensic evidence, specifically the blood-stained fabric fragment discovered in Washburn Wash. The prosecution's forensic pathologist testified that the quantity and distribution of blood found on the fabric suggested a violent event, likely involving fatal injuries. Without remains to examine, the expert emphasized that DNA concentration and blood spatter patterns were consistent with significant blood loss, sufficient to cause death. Supporting this, forensic geologists presented their findings on the soil composition embedded in the fabric. Through spectrographic analysis, they demonstrated that the trace minerals matched only a specific sector of Washburn Wash, narrowing the possible location of the crime scene. This scientific testimony helped anchor the prosecution's timeline and geographic theory, positioning James in areas where Jamie's evidence was recovered. Digital forensic analysts provided another layer of corroboration. They outlined cell tower data gaps, showing that James's phone lost signal in areas overlapping with Washburn-Wash during critical hours on the night Jamie disappeared. This, combined with vehicle tracking data and tire tread patterns found at the site, formed a circumstantial but tight loop around James's movements. Prosecutors also introduced financial records. While not directly linked to the crime, these records demonstrated a pattern of instability, including unemployment periods and frequent cash withdrawals, which aligned with James's erratic behavior during the weeks surrounding Jamie's disappearance. These financial markers suggested stress factors, contributing to the prosecution's argument of motive. The defense's counter-arguments focused on the lack of a body and direct eyewitnesses. They argued that all forensic findings were circumstantial, that no weapon had been recovered, and that James's prior history was being used to unfairly bias the jury. They emphasized reasonable doubt, citing gaps in the timeline and theoretical possibilities that Jamie could still be alive. To reinforce the prosecution's theory, Jamie's family members and co-workers testified about her routine stability, that she would not disappear voluntarily, that she maintained close ties to her children, and that she expressed specific fears about her relationship with James in the weeks prior to vanishing. In addition, the prosecution presented previous domestic disturbance reports involving James, though they stopped short of bringing in every past allegation, choosing to focus on those with documented evidence. This decision balanced the need to establish a behavioral pattern without overwhelming the jury with unrelated incidents. By the end of the prosecution's case in chief, the jury had heard from over a dozen witnesses, spanning forensic experts, behavioral analysts, and individuals familiar with James's history and Jamie's life. The defense prepared to respond, but the burden now rested on their ability to undermine the circumstantial framework that had been methodically constructed over nearly 2 years. As the prosecution rested its case in late 2022, the defense faced the challenge of dismantling the circumstantial framework built over years of forensic analysis, behavioral profiling, and expert testimony. The defense's approach centered on 3 pillars: emphasizing reasonable doubt, challenging the scientific interpretations, and casting Tracy James as a scapegoat in a system that often failed Indigenous men. James's attorneys opened by reiterating the absence of a body. They argued that no conclusive evidence proved Jamie Yazzie was dead. Without remains, they claimed, the possibility of voluntary disappearance, however unlikely, could not be excluded. The defense called attention to unconfirmed sightings of Jamie in nearby regions within weeks of her disappearance, although these reports lacked credible verification and were dismissed early in the investigation. Next, the defense attacked the forensic methodologies. They cross-examined the prosecution's forensic pathologist, pressing on the limitations of interpreting blood patterns without a body. They argued that the volume and placement of blood on the recovered fabric fragment could not definitively establish death, suggesting alternative scenarios such as non-lethal injury or fabric transfer unrelated to the crime. The defense also questioned the cell tower data analysis, noting that signal dropouts and coverage gaps were common in rural Arizona. They argued that Tracy James's phone inactivity on the night Jamie disappeared could not conclusively place him in Washburn-Wash. Defense experts presented alternative explanations for the soil composition found on the fabric, suggesting windborne transfer or secondary contamination, rather than direct contact with the crime scene. In support of James's character, the defense introduced community members who testified to his work ethic, family involvement, and lack of violent incidents in recent years. They portrayed him as a man targeted due to his past, not because of present actions. As the trial neared its close, the judge issued jury instructions emphasizing the standard of proof in a no-body homicide. The prosecution needed to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that Jamie Yazzie was dead, that her death was the result of criminal action, and that Tracy James was responsible. During jury deliberations, the panel reviewed the forensic evidence, expert testimony, and digital data presented. They evaluated whether the fabric fragment, the blood analysis, and the geolocation data formed a coherent narrative that proved the prosecution's theory. Deliberations lasted 4 days. Jurors asked to review maps of the Washburn-Wash area, forensic reports on the blood evidence, and cell tower data logs. While the lack of a body weighed heavily, the aggregate evidence, including the volume of Jamie's blood, James's history of violent control, and his unexplained movements, formed a cumulative case. On the fifth day, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on charges of first-degree murder and domestic violence resulting in death. The ruling marked a rare no-body conviction within federal jurisdiction over tribal lands. Tracy James remained expressionless as the verdict was read. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month, where prosecutors would argue for life imprisonment without parole. The verdict resonated beyond the courtroom. Advocates for missing and murdered Indigenous women, MMIW, highlighted the case as a landmark moment, demonstrating the potential for justice despite systemic gaps. Jamie Yazzie's family, though never able to recover her remains, found partial closure in the ruling. On March 17, 2023, the U.S. District Court reconvened for the sentencing of Tracy James, convicted of the first-degree murder of Jamie Yazzie. The prosecution argued for life imprisonment without parole, citing premeditation, behavioral escalation, and conscious concealment of a homicide. The defense challenged the severity, emphasizing the absence of Jamie's remains and framing the case as circumstantial, warning against setting dangerous precedent. Presiding Judge James L. Carr reviewed the case summary. He acknowledged the unusual weight placed on forensic evidence, behavioral patterns, and digital data in a no-body homicide. However, the cumulative case presented by the prosecution satisfied the threshold of beyond reasonable doubt. He imposed the maximum sentence: life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The victim impact statements added a human dimension to the proceedings. Jamie Yazzie's mother addressed the court, detailing the psychological toll of enduring uncertainty. She spoke of her daughter's commitment to her community, her role as a mother, and the irreparable void left behind. Despite the conviction, she reiterated the family's ongoing grief due to Jamie's body never being recovered. The family emphasized that while James would face consequences, they remained burdened by the incomplete resolution. The case's conclusion reverberated beyond the courtroom. Advocacy groups within the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women (MMIW) movement identified the Yazzie case as a pivotal example of justice achieved despite systemic challenges. Historically, MMIW cases suffered from jurisdictional confusion, resource limitations, and delayed responses, often leading to cold cases. The conviction without a body was considered a milestone, demonstrating that persistent investigation, cross-jurisdictional collaboration, and modern forensic techniques could overcome entrenched obstacles. Following the sentencing, the FBI and the Department of Justice, DOJ, conducted internal reviews. Their findings highlighted critical weaknesses in the coordination between tribal, federal, and state law enforcement. The initial delays in escalating Jamie's disappearance, along with jurisdictional overlaps, complicated the investigation's early stages. These reviews led to recommendations for systemic changes. Among the proposals, automatic federal escalation for missing person cases on tribal lands after 72 hours without resolution. This aimed to eliminate bureaucratic lag. Expanded forensic capacity for remote areas, including mobile forensic labs and enhanced geospatial mapping tools to improve evidence recovery and analysis in rugged terrain. Unified data integration platforms, ensuring real-time information sharing between tribal, federal, and state agencies. These policy recommendations aligned with broader efforts to strengthen tribal sovereignty while ensuring federal investigative support. The DOJ's report emphasized that effective cooperation, not control, was central to improving outcomes in future MMIW cases. In congressional hearings on public safety in tribal communities, Jamie Yazzie's case was frequently cited. Lawmakers and advocates called for federal funding to implement these procedural upgrades. They stressed that Yazzie's case, while successful in prosecution, exposed structural deficiencies that demanded attention. Meanwhile, Tracy James was transferred to a high-security federal prison where he would serve his life sentence. His conviction stood as a rare example of a no-body homicide case reaching resolution within federal jurisdiction over tribal lands. However, the absence of Jamie's remains continued to cast a shadow over the outcome. Federal authorities kept the investigation into the recovery of her body open, though prospects remained uncertain. In broader legal circles, Jamie Yazzie's case became part of training curricula for federal prosecutors and law enforcement officers handling no-body homicides. It served as a case study demonstrating how behavioral evidence, digital forensics, and geospatial science could converge to secure a conviction without the most critical piece of physical evidence. Her case also redefined the threshold for prosecutorial standards in MMIW cases. It illustrated that absence of a body does not equate to absence of justice, provided that the investigative process is rigorous, coordinated, and evidence-based. Though the courtroom proceedings had ended, the impact of Jamie Yazzie's case continued to influence policy debates, law enforcement training, and community advocacy efforts. Her name became synonymous with progress, albeit progress that came at significant cost. Her story remains a symbol of resilience within the MMIW movement and a catalyst for institutional reform. As federal and tribal agencies move toward improving investigative protocols, Yazzie's case stands as a reminder that justice in these cases is not just about convictions. It is about ensuring that every woman's story is heard, investigated thoroughly, and never dismissed. As we close this case, I can't help but reflect on the strength it takes to seek justice, even when the odds are against you. Jamie Yazzie's story reminds us that silence can be broken and that persistence matters. In the absence of her voice, the evidence spoke, through science, through patterns, through those who refuse to give up. In a world where many voices go unheard, how can we ensure that justice reaches every corner, every community? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you most in this case? Where are you watching from? Share your perspective in the comments. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, consider subscribing to the channel for more true crime investigations that matter. And if this wasn't your cup of tea, tell me why. I appreciate honest feedback.